Okay, let's get started. I wanted to start off this morning with an apology. On Tuesday, we were talking about the first human fatality by an autonomous car. So obviously not just another intellectual exercise. There was a human life that was lost, a particular person, and her name was? Elaine Hertzberg. Okay. A lot of what we talk about in this class is dry intellectual exercises. We were talking about a person that lost their life on Tuesday, so I apologize for that. Okay, so switching gears back to evolutionary robotics. We're working our way through a series of lectures on dealing with crossing the reality gap. We're going to finish lecture 17 in a few minutes on resilient machines. And just to reorient you again, we started this sub-theme with the radical envelope of noise hypothesis. It was back from the early 1990s, before physics engines existed. They used a very sophisticated simulator, which was a lookup table, where they applied noise to it. We jumped from 90s to 2000 when the Golem project was reported in the literature, which combined evolutionary robotics with these brand new technologies known as 3D printers. 2006, we're talking about a project I helped out with called Resilient Machines, and you saw last time why it's a resilient machine. We have a machine that is evolving not just controllers in a simulator and then transferring those controllers from simulation to reality, but a second evolutionary algorithm is evolving the simulator itself. So speaking of that, there was a question on Tuesday's quiz about that, and one of you brought out a good point, which is there was a question about, is the second evolutionary algorithm evolving the simulator or the body of the robot? And I went back and had a look, and it makes sense that either response could be considered correct. So in lecture 17, I was describing how we were evolving populations of simulators where really, in effect, the simulator itself is fixed, but we're evolving a virtual body inside the simulator, right? You could go deeper where you put actual aspects of the physics engine itself under evolutionary control. What might be some of those aspects? Friction, right? So the way in which the physics engine simulates friction, you could put that under evolutionary control. So in the default physics engine, the robot is usually running around on ice. It's usually running around on relatively low friction ground. But as you might have noticed in the video, the resilient machine is moving on carpet or plexiglass or something, not plexiglass, carpet, which has much higher friction. So maybe we should be evolving the friction parameters, friction coefficients in the simulator to better approximate the friction of the ground over which the robot is moving, right? So in the project we did in 2006, we were evolving the body of the robot in a simulator, and I've been using sort of verbal shorthand and saying we're evolving the simulator. But there is this important distinction. So if you answered the Tuesday's quizzes question with evolving the body rather than evolving the simulator, we'll give you back a point for that. Make sense? Yes?
I mean, this is kind of just, it might not matter, but
that's fine.
If you are putting too many parameters in the physics engine itself under evolutionary control, you could risk overfitting.
That isn't.
Even the robot would be very robust in other environments.
Exactly, that's a great point. Remember our discussion way back at the beginning of the semester about neural networks? If they're too big, they often will overfit the data and they'll sort of memorize the situations you provided to it rather than learning how to generalize from those examples. Same thing might happen with the physics engine if you put too many details under evolutionary control. No one has tried that yet. Might be a little overly ambitious for a final project in this class, but that would be a great project to try. Okay, good point. Okay, while we're on the topic of quizzes and moving back to the final project, I realized I fell behind with posting the weekly reports onto Blackboard. So for the grad students, I apologize for that. Even if you finish weekly report 3 and 4, you had nowhere to submit it on Blackboard. So if you could, please try and submit it by tonight. If you can't, let me know. So weekly report 3 and 4 up on Blackboard now. You can go ahead and submit. Okay. Undergrads, you're working on assignment 9, which will be due next Monday night as usual, and then you'll be moving on to the 10th and the final assignment. Okay, looking forward to next week. Next Tuesday, I won't be here. I'll be at a DARPA meeting in DC. One of my PhD students, Sam Kriegman, will be here, and he will be guest lecturing on soft robotics, which is normally the very last topic of the course, but you've heard enough now that you'll be able to absorb most of what Sam has to tell you. Sam is my PhD student. He took this course 2 years ago, so you'll sort of see what he's been doing in the interim. He'll show you some of his current research on soft robotics. Just as a heads up, in order to evolve his soft robots, he's using HyperNeat. So you might want to go back and have a quick look through the lecture slides or the lecture video on HyperNeat and refresh your understanding of what HyperNeat is and what HyperNeat does. And you'll be ready for Sam's lecture on Tuesday. I won't be here, but there still will be a quiz as usual Tuesday night. And then I'll be back here on Thursday. All good? Any questions about assignments, final project, quizzes, schedule? All good? Okay, so back to the fun stuff. Resilient machines. So I was walking you last time through one evolutionary run with the physical resilient machine, which starts with an empty simulator, performs a random action, uses that random action to evolve an understanding of self, evolves these populations of simulators, or populations of bodies in simulators, if you like. Doesn't have enough information, so it goes back and does another physical action, goes back to the simulator, and goes back and forth from reality and the simulator until eventually all of the simulations converge in the population, and all of the simulators say, robot, you are a radially symmetric machine with 4 legs, and each of the 4 legs has an upper part and a lower part. Right? The fact that in the population all of the models have converged on this one description of self, that's the way that the physical robot knows. That's how it's put together. Yes, question?
When the robot's trying to figure out where its parts are,
yes.
And it sort of figures out one and it moves it in the simulation, it like changes the information.
Yes.
How do you like code that, or how do you like program it to just do those things on its own?
Okay, so what we did is we created an empty simulator. We created these 9 parts, but they weren't placed in the simulator yet. We had our Python code, which talks to the simulator in the same way that you have in your assignments. We had a genome, which normally for you guys encodes numbers which represent synaptic weights, right? So we changed that vector, so now it encoded integers. And there were 8 integers, which correspond to the 8 parts. So the robot knows it has these 8 parts. And so the integers indicate which other part that part is attached to. So if the first of the 8 numbers, in the vector was the integer 3, that means the robot thinks that this part is attached to this third part, right? If this integer was 6, it would attach this object to the 6th object. So in essence, the genome is the robot trying to figure out how to connect all the pieces together. That's a bit of an oversimplification because there were other numbers in the genome, the blueprint that said where on the other object is that object attached, and at which orientation, and how do they move, and so on. But that's the basic idea. Right? So the genome is not encoding the brain, a set of synaptic weights, it's encoding a body. Okay, good question. Okay, so again, the resilient machine is going back and forth between reality and simulation to try and come up with an understanding of self. That's evolutionary algorithm number 1. Once it has algorithm number 1, once it has an understanding of self, it starts up a second evolutionary algorithm, which takes the best simulator, the best description of self, and evolves controllers on that simulator, as we've seen many times before. Takes the best of those controllers and tries it out in reality, and usually, well, maybe not usually, but a lot of the time, These controllers transfer from simulation to reality pretty well, which is particularly surprising because the simulator is not that accurate. The legs are bent. It's not perfect. Why would these controllers transfer more from simulation to reality compared to if we just sat down, like you did in assignment 8, and built the simulation by hand? Why do these controllers tend to be more transferable?
Because the physical robot isn't actually symmetric. Like you were saying that the battery is off-centered, so the center of mass isn't in the center.
Exactly, right? So thinking about thinking is misleading. You see this machine, you sit down and manually create a simulator, and obviously the simulator should be perfectly radially symmetric, right? But from the robot's point of view, where it's constructing or it's evolving these simulators based only on its own experiences, that is a better description of self than the one that you created in assignment 8, right? And because this is a more accurate, it's not a perfectly accurate reflection, but it's a better reflection of reality than something created by hand, more of those controllers tend to transfer from this simulator to reality than they do from a hand-coded simulator to reality. Right? Okay, so that's part 1, which helps with the reality gap. But we were very excited about this result, so we kept going. I said, what else could we do with this approach? Well, we can just keep going. If the robot changes, or if the robot's environment changes, or the robot itself changes, it knows something has changed because when it performs a new action here, it now tilts 40 degrees to the left or to the right, where before, when it was intact, it tilted only 20 degrees to the right. So it doesn't know that it's physically damaged, but it knows that something has changed. So it stops moving, it stops doing what it's supposed to do, and goes back to improving the simulator. And I showed you this video last time, where it starts with the 4-legged simulator and gradually evolves it to the 3.5-legged simulator. So the robot is sort of able to autonomously diagnose what the problem is, right? It knows it now has 3.5 legs. It's got a correct diagnosis. Step 2, starts up the second evolutionary algorithm again and re-evolves a new controller for its new situation. And that new controller tends to be quite different, or the new behavior tends to be quite different from the old behavior, right? What worked when you have 4 legs probably isn't going to work when you only have 3.5. Okay, basic idea here is going back and forth from simulation to reality. Okay. I apologize for the quality of this image here, but as I mentioned before, this is often known as the estimation exploration algorithm because the robot is estimating or creating a simulation of self. It's estimating its current situation. And then I apologize about this down here. This is the exploitation part, where it actually uses the simulator to evolve a controller and then transfers it to reality. If something changes, it goes back here. There is actually a third evolutionary algorithm, which is the exploration part. This part has to do with the robot alternating back and forth between reality and simulation. And last time I said the robot just performs an action to get some new information. It doesn't perform that new action randomly. At the beginning, when the robot knows nothing, all it has is an empty simulator. The only thing it can do is act randomly. It chose to rotate motors 1 and 5 down, and all the other motors it rotated upward. Once it does one pass and goes back and is about to perform the second action isn't random. It chooses it carefully. If you were the resilient machine, what kinds of actions would you perform? You've performed one action so far, which is rotate motors 1 and 5 down, and all the others up. What are you going to do in your second attempt?
The opposite.
The opposite, right? So you're definitely not going to do exactly the same thing because you're not going to get a lot more information, right? So you want to try and do something differently. And what that exact opposite or different thing is actually non-trivial to figure out. And I think we'll just leave it there. If you're interested in the details, you can go read the paper. But the robot is actually choosing what to do next very carefully. So there are actually, in the entire experiment, these 3 different evolutionary algorithms: estimation, exploration, and exploitation. In the first evolutionary algorithm, the phenotype, right, the thing that the blueprint encodes or creates is a body in a simulator. The fitness function in the estimation evolutionary algorithm is looking for similarity, right? It's got a physical self and a virtual self. Both of them are moved. Motors 1 and 5 rotate down. Both the physical robot and the virtual robot generate sensor data. You compare those two sets of sensor data, and the closer the match between the physical and virtual sensor data, the more fit or more accurate that simulator is. Okay. In the exploitation evolutionary algorithm, this one's a little bit more familiar, right? The phenotype is the controller, the thing that controls the robot. It wasn't actually a neural network controller in this case, but it doesn't matter. It's a string of numbers that dictate how the robot moves. And fitness, as we've seen many times, is simply forward displacement of the best robot. And we'll leave the exploration algorithm for another time. Okay, so in the series of videos, I walked you through just one evolutionary run. There were 3 evolutionary algorithms actually running during that period, but we looked at one evolutionary run. What happens if we do it more than once? Well, we actually did this 30 times, and this is what we got. So the outline is the actual resilient machines, right? In reality, at least geometrically, it's perfectly radially symmetric. The solid shapes here represent where the evolutionary algorithm placed the body parts at the end of 16 trials. Remember, in each one of these runs, the robot was able to go back and forth 16 times between reality and simulation. This is not including the damaged part, the phase 2. This is just phase 1, right? Start with no knowledge of self and see if you can figure out how you're put together. How did these 30 evolutionary trials do? Not bad. Again, not perfect. This one is clearly wrong, right? And this one is sort of wrong, right? Actually, this might not be too bad because actually it might be trying to approximate the mass distribution of the robot. So it's hard to eyeball these and know exactly how well they did, but some of them it's clearly not quite there yet. Maybe it needs a 17th or an 18th attempt to sort of figure out where this particular piece belongs. Do you have a question?
The dark boxes are the ones that had really high fitness or something?
Exactly. The dark boxes are the ones that got the topology right. So topology means connectivity, the way things are connected together, right? So if you look at the solid boxes, all of the pieces are attached correctly. They may be bent a little bit, but the topology is correct, right? Topology is incorrect here, correct here, and so on. The thin black lines, which you can see in just the top left one, those thin black lines in run number 1 represent the amount of error or the amount of fitness. So again, when you start work on your final project, one of the things you're going to have to do is communicate to us, here are 30 evolutionary trials that I did. How well did they do? You need to think creatively about how to communicate to us visually how well these runs did, right? So you can look at the final results from these 30 evolutionary trials and get at least a basic sense of which ones did better or worse. Depending on what you do on your final project, I want you to think carefully about how do I visually communicate how well or how poorly one of my evolutionary runs did. Okay, question?
So when you're doing these repeated 30 generations or whatever, is it...
These are 30 evolutionary runs.
Okay.
Within each one run, there may be hundreds or thousands of generations where it goes back and forth between reality and the simulator.
Are you having the robot like perform different actions, and is it still good at doing the first thing when you add like, because it feels like if you say like move this way, it's good at doing that, and you're like, move this way, like forget how to do the first thing.
I might forget how to do the first thing. So there's no forgetting here. The robot always keeps all the information. So when it performs the first random action, keeps that information, does a little bit of evolution in the simulators, goes back to reality and performs a second action. which is going to be different from the first one, gets some sensor data from there, goes back, tries to match both pieces, and onward. So in each of these 30 trials, in each one of these 30 trials, the physical robot performs 16 actions. But between different evolutionary trials, the robot might have chosen different actions, right? When you run your, where are you at now? You're at the genetic algorithm, the parallel hill climber, the genetic algorithm. When you run it, again, there we go. Okay. When you run your parallel hill climber, your genetic algorithm a second time, you get a different result, right? In the same way, when the resilient machine starts with an empty simulator and chooses a random action, that pushes the evolutionary algorithms, the three of them, down a different path, right? Some of those paths led to better results than others. Does that answer your question? Okay. Here's a time series from the run that we watched, the videos that we watched. So you can see in the top panels, the simulated robot, that's what the evolutionary algorithm predicted the physical robot would do. Remember that it takes an evolved simulator and evolves a good controller on it. That's this good controller here. From the physical robot's point of view, it says, I think this is what I'm going to do in reality if I try it out. And then the robot tries it out. And one of the things that was surprising to us when we carried this out is that when you cross the reality gap, it isn't black and white. It isn't that some controllers do very well and produce more or less the same behavior you saw in simulation. Others fail miserably. You get actually similarities and differences throughout the gate cycle itself, right? So if you look carefully here, it takes a little bit to look at these and sort of figure out how the robot is actually moving. At this point here, the robot is starting to stand up on its front, on its left and right legs and lifting up its front and back legs, which makes it statically unstable. Remember our discussion about legged locomotion? It's not stable when it's up on its left and right foot. So it's either going to tip forward or backward. In the simulator, at that moment, the simulator predicted when it went up on its left and right feet that it would tip backwards, but it didn't. It actually tipped forward, which again makes sense because the robot is trying to estimate not only its geometry, but its mass distribution. And that's going to be a tricky thing to get right. So the mass distribution is a little bit inaccurate in the simulator, so it's a little bit more back heavy than it is in reality. So it predicts when it stands up, it's going to fall backwards, where in reality it fell forward. Before I ran these experiments, I would have suspected at this point, that's it. It's made an incorrect prediction and nothing's going to work after that. But it actually recovers and continues on. So I wanted to just show you this figure to show that crossing the reality gap is not a black and white issue. There's gray here. Some things work and it can actually recover and continue on. Yes, question?
So in the simulation where it jumps from 2.6 to 3.1, does it
Yep.
just kind of like just jump, or does it actually sort of like move itself?
It's actually moving. So you can go back and watch the actual video, and if you watch carefully, you can see this point where it pulls up on its left and right and falls back. And then in that half second there between 2.6 and 3.1 seconds, it moves in some other way that causes it to recover and carry on moving. Okay. Okay, last visualization, we'll move on to the next project. If you go back and watch the video, if you watch carefully, you'll see that the robot is moving over a piece of plexiglass that we put on top of a tabletop. And we did that because every time the physical robot moved, it did its thing, and then it stopped moving. We went in with a colored marker and put a colored dot on the plexiglass. We did that a bunch of times, and then we stood up the plexiglass and took a photo of it and turned that into this figure. The blue dots, there should be 30 of them. They correspond to the 30 evolutionary trials that we did. So we took the best controller from these 30 trials and transferred it to reality. The robot starts at 0, 0, a particular point on the plexiglass, which is towards the left of the table, and then starts moving. And again, I apologize for my camera work here. Visually rotate this 90 degrees. So further down means further to the right on the table. Down Further to the further downward is better. Okay. The circled blue dot that you see there, that's the actual gate that I showed you in the video. That's the physical robot moving. And there were 29 others of them. And most of those blue dots, almost all of them, caused the robot to move from the left side of the table to the right side of the table, which means that most of those blue controllers transferred well from simulation to reality. The black dots, which actually we didn't put on the plexiglass, and we couldn't because they came from the simulator, right? So the simulator said, I think the robot is going to move to this position, which we marked as a black dot in this two-dimensional plane. We took that controller, put it on the physical robot moved, and then we marked its final position with a blue marker. And again, the circled black dot there corresponds to the simulated gate that you see here. So the way in which the robot moved was pretty similar, but the simulator predicted that the robot would move twice as far as it actually did. So yes, we crossed the reality gap. We got the desired behavior, which was moved from left to right, but the prediction wasn't great, right? It was off by about 50%.
The crosshair is like center of mass of the distributions.
Exactly. So the crosshairs, the center of each crosshair represents the mean horizontal and vertical position of those 30 movements, those 30 behaviors. And the crosshairs themselves represent 95% confidence intervals, error bars.
It kind of seems like it's just like a systematic error of under or overestimating how far it could go, whereas I think last month we were talking about something where like certain controllers did terrible, but then it predicted very well for other kinds of controllers.
That's true. So our resilient machines is a hopeless optimist here, right? It always predicts it's going to do better than it actually does. This is something that most of us humans also suffer from. But there you go. Okay. But you're right. We looked at another project where that wasn't the case. Okay. So what are the red dots? Red dots were a sanity check we did. We created 30 random controllers, no evolution, no simulation. We just generated 30 random controllers and ran them on the physical robot. And as we would expect, most of the dots stay at about the origin. So the fact that blue dots, generally speaking, are further down or further to the right of the red dots means good. Generally speaking, the resilient machines method is helping the robot cross the reality gap. The red dots are actually not perfectly centered at the origin. They're a little bit tilted down because we figured out that the table we ran the robot at was declined by 1.7 millimeters. So there was a little bit of we're giving the robot a little bit of help there, but there you go. Okay, I think that's it. Yep. Any questions about the Resilient Machines project before we move on? Okay. Okay, so we're going to switch now. That was some work we did back in 2006. In 2010, another approach was introduced to deal with the reality gap, which is known as the Transferability Project. And what's the idea behind the Transferability Project? Well, the researchers here started by asking an interesting question, which is, could the transferability of a controller be added to the fitness function? Could we actually evolve controllers, not just in how fast they get the robot to move, but on how transferable they are? How well do they transfer from simulation to reality? That question, as always, raises 10 more questions, however, which is, how would we actually define transferability? So before we go any further, how might you define transferability? If I give you a controller and ask you to tell me how transferable is it, give me back a number on how transferable it is, how would you calculate that number?
Difference between the fitness of the physical robot and simulation?
Would make sense, right? Good, obvious place to start. We just looked at the blue and the black dots, right? What's the difference? What's the distance between the blue and the black dot? How off was it in its prediction about how far it would move and how far it actually moved? Okay, makes sense. Good place to start. And I've got the wrong lecture here. Give me a second. So in this project, they're going to use two different fitness objectives. The first one is the one we've seen many times now. One is going to reward for the desired behavior, which in this case is going to be movement again. And the second one is going to be a punishment term, which punishes for the difference between the real behavior and predicted behavior in simulation. So we have behavior B and distance D, and we could try and combine these in the way that they were combined when we looked at the bipedal locomotion project, the Silly Walks project. We could take behavior, we want to maximize B, and we could multiply it by 1 over 1 plus D, the difference between these two behaviors, right? So a robot is going to get high fitness if it moves quickly, and if the difference between its behavior in simulation and reality is low. Okay? However, there turns out that there's a problem when you try and add and multiply terms together, in that it's related to this idea of overfitting that was mentioned before. If you try this, and for those of you that have made it to assignment 10, you've already seen this in action. Evolution, she's a great satisfier, but she's also a little bit lazy, and she will often maximize one of these terms and forget about the other one. It's difficult to find a controller that maximizes this and minimizes this. So why don't we just maximize one and sort of forget about the other one? Mediocre value or a low value for the other one, and evolution will just try and improve this one. Or evolution will try and improve this term and sort of leave this term at a mediocre value. So there is another step beyond genetic algorithms that you can make to multi-objective optimization. Has a very nice acronym here. So instead of multiplying these two terms together, we're going to break them apart. And by doing so, we're going to try and force evolution to optimize both of them. And the way we do this is when we have two objectives, we're going to plot each individual in the population as a point, and its position in this plane corresponds to its values for these two fitness objectives. So this is different from a fitness landscape. This is actually embedding these solutions in a plane. And given what I've told you, we're trying to maximize behavior and maximize transferability. And I apologize, I'm going to switch back and forth between T, which is maximizing transferability, which is minimizing distance. So if you want, you can think of T as being more or less equal to 1 over 1 plus D. The lower D, the higher transferability. Okay. Where would we like these points to fall in the plane?
You want like a straight line up to the right.
We'd like a straight line up to the right? We'd like to try and find in the fitness landscape a controller that has very high behavior, gets the robot to move quickly, and very high transferability. The robot does the same thing in simulation that it does in reality. Imagine in this cartoon example here, we start our multi-objective optimizer with a population of random controllers. And as you would expect, most random controllers are going to be nowhere near the upper right. It's going to be hard to find those fitness peaks. Most of them are going to be sprinkled in the lower left here. You can see that some of these are specialists. So just by chance, this particular controller here gets the robot to move quickly in simulation. But when we transfer it to reality, it has very low transferability. On the physical robot doesn't move at all. Over here, we have another separate controller. This controller transfers perfectly well from simulation to reality for the simple reason that this controller doesn't get either the simulated robot or the physical robot to move at all, right? If you're a controller and you tell the robot to stay still, that's going to transfer very well to reality. If you multiply these two terms together, rather than use this multi-objective approach, you tend to get solutions that cluster around the upper left or the lower right, which is not where we want to be. We want to be in the upper right. So how do we push the population towards the upper right? The way we do that is we're going to select some of the individuals in this population to survive and reproduce, and others we're going to kill off. Which ones would you kill off, given this visualization?
Wait, if you want
We might want to get rid of this one or this one. Maybe, but they are doing well at one of the two things. So let's set those two specialists aside for the moment. Which ones are clearly destined for the chopping block here?
Probably the ones at the bottom left.
The ones that are at the bottom left. These down here are doing poorly on both objectives. So those, for sure, we're going to get rid of. So let's try and be a little bit more formal in how we do this. We're going to define or put each of these controllers into one of two boxes, the dominated box or the non-dominated box. What makes for a dominated solution? A dominated solution is one for which there is some other solution in the population that is better at both objectives. Okay? So if I pick a point, like this point, for example, and I look at all the other n-1 points, there is at least one other point, this one, which is both better in terms of behavior. This point is higher than this point, and this point is more transferable than this one, because this point lies further to the right. Right? So I visited this point, and I color it as a dominated point, set it aside for the moment, visit this point, and this point is dominated by this point. It's also dominated by this one, so we label this one dominated, and on we go. Let's look at the specialists. So I visit this specialist in the upper left. There is no other point which is above and to the right of this point, so it's not dominated. Same thing for this specialist down here. This point also has no points above and to the right of it. This one, and this one. So these 6 points become the set of non-dominated solutions. When I first made these slides, I made a mistake. There's one mislabeling in this picture, and I've left that mistake in there for you to test your intuition about this. Which one is mislabeled?
The bottom right, not filled in.
This one, right? So this one is actually non-dominated. There's no point that is above and to the right of it. So if you're drawing this picture, color these 7 points black, and there should be a line from this point to this point and from this point to this point. Okay, so we've now categorized these points into a dominated and non-dominated set. What do you think we do with the dominated set? They're gone, right? We delete the dominated set, and the non-dominated individuals survive and produce offspring. One final piece of terminology. We typically refer to the set of non-dominated solutions as the non-dominated front, as you can see. So if you sort of think about maps from the Second World War, you have this front that is trying to march towards a particular target. And we know where our non-dominated front is trying to march, up and to the right. Right? So if you look at our non-dominated front here, you'll notice that we now have a variety of solutions, some which are very specialized, and some which are making progress at least on both solutions at the same time. That's the important part about using multi-objective optimization compared to what you can now think of as uni-objective optimization. Right? So even if we have multiple terms, we're combining them into just one objective, uni-objective optimization. In this project, we're going to look at multi-objective optimization. It's a pretty simple algorithm, as you can imagine. So if in your final project you're having a hard time evolving your robots to do what you want them to do, you might consider moving from uni-objective to multi-objective optimization. Okay. So we kill off the individuals in the dominated set. We then we have 7 survivors, so we roll a 7-sided die, and whatever number comes up, we choose that individual on the front at random, and it produces an offspring. In this case, let's imagine that this particular parent produced this particular offspring. What happens at the next generation? Which of these 2 individuals, if either, survives? The new one, right? Evolution is harsh here, right? The new individual dominates the parent. Parent is deleted, and the child survives. And the front marches a little bit towards up and to the right. So you can imagine this process. If you were to visualize evolution proceeding, this front is going to march up and to the right over time. Okay. Question?
Do you need to like reinvent or how many new children are you making? And does that mean you have to reevaluate everybody? Because now, like, if it's over here, then that might kill 2 below.
Good question. Okay. So let's go back a step. So we have this parent that just produced this child. That's just one child. How many children are actually produced?
6.
Not 6. Oh, wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Got to remember this one is on the front. 5, right? So we've just killed off these 5 dominated solutions. So we have 5 empty slots in the population. So we keep rolling our 7-sided die, pick one of the 7 individuals on the front, produce a copy of it, but don't evaluate it yet, just make a copy. Put that copy in the first of the 5 empty slots, roll a 7-sided die again, pick one of the 7 individuals on the front, make a randomly modified copy of it, put it in the second of the 5 slots, and keep going until you've created 5 new individuals. Now, evaluate the fitness, or evaluate the behavior and transferability of all 5 individuals, and we're back to a full population. Then we select who's dominated and who's non-dominated, kill off the dominated ones, and continue. So in this cartoon example, we had 7 survivors on the front, and we had 5 that died off, and so we produced 5 children to replace them. What's going to happen at the next generation? Are we going to have 7 parents again?
Maybe.
Maybe, right? Not necessarily.
Do you decide to start shrinking the culling the outer? At what point do you start culling the outer bits?
You could start to delete the specialists if you want. Usually just we keep things simple and you just let them go. The 2 specialists sort of stay, they sort of anchor the front, right? They sort of move, sometimes they move with the front or they stay where they are. You could delete them if you wanted. Usually they're just left. Yes?
So as this is going on, a person has to physically evaluate. Yeah, so that's kind of laborious.
That's kind of laborious, right? Kind of defeats the whole purpose. If we're taking every single controller and transferring it to reality to measure transferability, why are we using the simulator at all? We might as well just be doing everything in reality, right? So there's a second part to this method to get over that issue. We'll come back to that in a moment.
Do the specialists ever move more or less?
They do, absolutely. So the easiest thing for evolution to do actually is to push up and to the left, and down and to the right, right? It's easy for evolution to keep improving one of the 2 objectives and sort of forget about the other one. So you actually see over-specialization or overfitting in this situation where you have specialists moving into the corners as far as they can go, right? Evolution will keep looking for the one that has the best B and forget about D, vice versa.
Like the one that is down to the right moves up into the left, like opposite. Like because it is so specialized on one side, and you say, "Great, you've done a good job there," it just starts working on the opposite.
Not necessarily, right? Ones that are up and to the left tend to produce children that are near them, that are also specialists like them. Right? Okay, so just a couple more notes about multi-objective optimization before we get back to the reality gap. What I've just described to you here is multi-objective optimization with 2 objectives. Are we limited to 2 objectives? Could go to 3, right? Again, remember the lecture on bipedal locomotion. There were 7 or 8 terms in that fitness function, right? We're not necessarily limited to 2 objectives. If we go to 3 objectives, what does the front look like? Be more specific.
Well, like
A balloon in what sense?
a surface.
It looks like a surface, right? So when we have 2 objectives, or if we have D objectives, so D represents the number of dimensions, here we have 2 dimensions, the front is always going to be D minus 1, right? It's 1 less. So in 2 dimensions, the front is a line. In 3 dimensions, the front is a surface. In 4 dimensions, the front is a volume, and so on. Right? Okay, we can do that. Last point about multi-objective optimization. There's a problem, however, when we start to go to higher dimensions. What is it?
You reduce your selection pressure.
You reduce your selection pressure. And why is that the case? Well, an easy way to figure this out is to think about this front, and instead of going to higher dimensions, let's go to less. Imagine we do multi-objective optimization with one objective. All the points obviously then lie on a line. They're all embedded in a one-dimensional space. If you embed a bunch of points in a line, how many individuals are on the front? One, right? No matter where those points are, there's always going to be one that is furthest to the right, the best one, right? So we only have one individual on the front. When we go to 2 dimensions, as you can see in this cartoon, we have 6 or 7 individuals on the front. It's not constant, but it's usually more than 1. When you go to 3 dimensions, you often, unless you have a big enough population, you get most of the individuals on the front. The more and more objectives there are, you're more and more likely to survive because you happen to be the best one at the 13th of 100 features, right? You're always going to be better than someone else at one thing. You may be worse at everything else, but you're a specialist, right? You're on the front. I think we've talked about this before. This is one aspect of the curse of dimensionality. We can go up to higher and higher dimensions, but when you do, things get bad faster than you think they will, right? We can do 1, we can do 2, 3 maybe is doable. Even 3 becomes difficult. So we run experiments in the lab sometimes with 3 objectives, and we usually get 200 or 300 individuals on the front, in which case selection pressure slows down because everybody's good. Very few individuals, if any, die off. So you need a population size of several thousand to make up for it. Okay, that's multi-objective optimization. So let's come back to the reality gap. How is this going to work if we're actually transferring every controller from simulation to reality? That doesn't make much sense. Let's look at some real data first. And I apologize, in this project, they go back and forth between trying to get better at transferability, meaning moving further to the right, or minimizing disparity or distance, which means moving to the left. They're both the same thing. It's either this or this. So in the real experiment here, they were trying to push up and to the left. At this particular point in time, they were at generation I+1. The X's show where the population used to be at generation I, and the black and white circles show where the population has moved to at generation I+1. Again, you can see that they've indicated the individuals on the front. So in this case, they have 10 or 12 individuals on the front. You'll notice on the horizontal axis here, they mention approximated disparity or approximated distance. What that means is they're approximating or predicting disparity before they've transferred these controllers from simulation to reality. Right? Which should raise yet another question in your mind. How can they approximate transferability before you've transferred the controller? We'll come back to that also in a moment. So they took all of these controllers, they approximated disparity, and I'll tell you how they did that in a moment. Then they took all those controllers, actually sent them to the physical robot, and got this picture. Now, the horizontal axis is exact disparity. How well they actually transfer. So the black dots are predicting, generally speaking, that things are going to transfer well to reality. How well was their approximation method? How well did approximated disparity correspond to exact disparity? Not bad, right? The black dots are still more or less up and to the left, but not perfect, right? So they have some way of approximating disparity before transferring something to reality, and it seems to work pretty well. What is that approximation? Okay, we'll come back to that. So this lecture is organized a little bit differently, as you've already probably figured out. We're going from question to potential solution, which raises 2 more questions, and so on. Okay, so in order to compute transferability for each controller, we'd have to evaluate it on the real robot, which is an obvious problem. So the solution is we're going to try and approximate it. How does that work? Let's take our front. Sorry about the quality here. Hopefully you can see all those dots there. We create our initial random population. We compute the behavior for all of these in simulation. So we know the height of all the points, but we haven't transferred these points to reality yet. So we don't actually know the horizontal position of these points. So let's put them all on a line. We actually don't know how transferable they are they are yet. We're going to take one of them and send them to reality and measure its actual transferability. Which one do you want to send? Which point here, which controller should we send to reality?
The one with the slowest behavior.
The one with the slowest behavior? This one down here? Okay, I don't have an axis on here, but let's imagine this simulated robot goes nowhere, doesn't move. You want to still transfer it to reality? What do you think is going to happen? You're pretty sure about what's going to happen with the point at the bottom, right? The simulated robot didn't move. Probably not going to move in reality. Perfect transferability, right? So you're only going to be able to send a few of these across. We have a limited budget, right? You could stay 36 hours straight at the lab and transfer 100 if you want. Let's try and do this in 8 hours and only send a dozen. So let's think carefully about which ones we want to send to reality.
Would it be better to pick the ones kind of in the middle to avoid the specialists?
Okay, we might want to pick the ones in the center, which is a good call, right? Because you're becoming a little bit more conservative by now. You could probably guess the ones at the top, probably not going to do very well, right? They're specialists. But let's be naive optimists and let's actually take the one at the top. And maybe we just got lucky. We had a good simulator. It's gonna work, right? Let's see. We could pick one in the middle. Let's try and get out of the lab before too long, and let's take the one at the top, which is exactly what they did. Here's their simulator. Here's their robot. Here's how well it did in the simulator. So not bad, right? So you can think of this as the best individual in the population at that point. They took that one, transferred it to reality, and got this. Okay, can't go for a coffee break yet. Didn't transfer at all, right? The gates, actually, if you watch them, they look similar. So the motion transfers. The motion transfers, but displacement does not, right? The robot doesn't actually move very well. Obviously, right? It must be the floor.
Right? Like if you look at the one on the right, the one on the left is like pushing with its front, bottom left foot, whereas the one in reality just like slips. You can see like
No.
falls over it.
It's sliding, right? Obviously, all we need to do is do a better approximation of the floor. Good, I see some of you shaking your heads, right? Thinking about thinking is misleading here. It looks like the problem is the floor. You can be sure by now that it ain't the floor. Okay, so what's the problem? We'll see. Okay, so remember we've just transferred one from reality. We took the point at the top, transferred it, and now we know the horizontal position of at least that point transfers terribly. Okay, we got to send a second controller to reality. Which one do you want to send now? I'm not going to send the bottom one. That one we're sure is going to transfer well. One at the top did terribly. Now the middle one, right? Now we're ready for the middle one. Why not this one? This is a different controller. It does very well in simulation. Why not send this one?
Like it's probably, if it did similar to the one we just tried, then it's not going to do good.
Exactly right. Once bitten, twice shy, right? This point, at least vertically, is close to the other one. We don't know if they're related or whether they move in the same way, but they're similar in some regard. So if they're similar in terms of behavior, maybe they are similar in terms of their transferability. Question mark. That's a hypothesis, right? But intuitively, they're probably the same. So let's go somewhere else, right? Let's find a different behavior, which in this case would be the middle, right? Send that one across, and we're probably less sure about the transferability of the one in the middle. That's why there are those two gray dots far from one another in the middle left there. Okay, so our solution here is we're going to try and estimate transferability of a controller based on its behavioral similarity to a tested controller, one we've already sent across. So that's great, right? We're going to try and measure similarity and say, that one transferred poorly, so let's go find a different one. Good solution, but yet again raises another problem. What do we mean by similar and different? We could just use behavior, right? Displacement. But can we do a little bit better than that? How do we measure the similarity between behaviors? Well, we're going to do that by actually looking at not just how far the robot moves, but how it moves. So we're now going to define a vector B, and this is a vector with 3 elements in it, which represent 3 different features of the behavior, 3 different features of the behavior. So the first one is the most obvious one. Given that controller, how far did the robot actually move? The researchers sort of arbitrarily made up 2 other features just to make sure we can measure similarity better. They looked at the mean height of the robot during travel. So as the robot moved, what was the average height of the chassis? And then as the robot moved, what was the final orientation of the robot? Was it pointed in the same direction of travel, or had it rotated a little bit during movement? So for each single controller, we can run that controller in simulation and get back these 3 F values. We can take a second controller, the one we transferred to reality, and compute the 3 Fs for that one as well, and then take the difference, the Euclidean distance, between those 2 behavior vectors, right? So the behavioral distance between controller 1 and controller 2 is the Euclidean distance between the behaviors generated by those 2 controllers. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We're now talking about controllers and behaviors. Controller generates behavior. Okay. So that's distance between controllers. So now we've got to take that distance and use it to compute transferability. Okay. So transferability now is pretty easy. It's just the negative of the distance, right? The more different the behavior generated by a controller in simulation and a controller in reality, the greater that distance or that difference, the lower transferability is. Right? Okay. So transferability becomes a negative number, but again, the higher the value of transferability, the less distance between the behaviors seen in simulation and seen in reality. Okay. So far, so good? It's pretty intuitive, I think. Okay. Okay. So that's transferability. Assuming we actually transfer something to reality, it's relatively easy to calculate transferability. But remember, we want to be able to try and estimate or predict transferability before we send something to reality, right? We need to be able to plot the horizontal position of a point, which is our prediction about how transferable that solution actually is. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to multiply these 2 terms together. Let's focus on the second term first. We're going to perform a summation. And we're going to sum over all of the controllers that belong to CT, which is the set of controllers we've already sent to reality. So in the cartoon example, we sent 1 across. So CT would be a set that contains just one element for now. Okay. So we're looking at, we're trying to estimate the transferability of a controller C. We've evaluated it in simulation. We haven't sent it to reality yet. We're going to compare C against each CI, which are all the controllers that we've already sent to reality, CT. So we're going to take each one CI. We're going to ask how transferable was that CI? How well did that other controller transfer from simulation to reality? So that number is going to be bigger if it transferred well. And we divide it by the distance between the current controller that we're trying to estimate transferability for and the CI. What behavior did it produce in simulation? Why are we dividing by the distance between those 2 things? So we're trying to estimate the transferability of C. We take the transferability of CI and divide it by the distance between C and CI.
Is it kind of giving you a way to compare things that are close together versus far apart? Because if it's far apart, then your transferability was huge, but they're not actually that close.
Exactly, right? So I don't really care, the robot doesn't really care about things that are far away, right? Transferred controllers that are very different, the distance between C and CI is big. We don't care about that. We're not going to base our prediction on the transferability of that very different controller. It's not helping us very much. I would prefer to estimate the transferability of C using some other CI which is more similar to me. How well did things that were close to me transfer, right? That's the intuition here, which you sort of ran in your head. You suggested that we don't send the second highest point across, because intuitively you know that second point is close to the one you're thinking about, and it's probably going to transfer similarly, right? So what we're looking at in this second term is a weighted sum, right? I'm taking the average of the transferability of all the other CIs, and I'm weighting that average by how close they are to me. I'm going to discount in that weighted average things that are far from me. Right? So I'm going to sum up over all the CIs in CT, and that's going to give me a single number. And a big number means I predict that I'm going to transfer well. C is going to transfer well from simulation to reality. If the weighted sum is low, the prediction is that that particular C is not going to transfer well from simulation to reality. Okay. Remember that we have a population of Cs. We have a whole bunch of controllers which we're trying to decide which one should we send to reality next. So we have to perform this computation for each C in the current population. For each C, they're going to have different distances from the CIs, right? Because some of them will be closer or further away. So this weighted sum is going to be different for different individuals. So we're going to normalize by the distance here. So we're trying to normalize the number for each of these C's so we can compare them, right? At the end, we've done this computation for each C in the population, and whichever C has the highest value, that's the one that we send to reality, right? Given all the experiences we've collected from the physical robot, given all the controllers that we got back from CT, or that we have in CT, we make an estimate about how well we transfer, and away we go. Okay. Okay. So we're going to try and transfer the one that is most different from the one in the population. So imagine now, I'm sorry, I misspoke. We are not sending the one to reality that has the highest computation. I forgot. I apologize. We're not using this. We're going to do one last computation, which is diversity here. So we're going to look at each of our C's, and we're going to calculate the diversity of C. We're looking for the C which is as far, we're going to calculate how close its closest neighbor is. I apologize, I'm not explaining this well. We take each C in the population. We compare its distance to the other CIs, the ones that we've transferred to reality. And we find its closest neighbor, which one has the minimum distance, and we assign that to that C. So we go through all the C's, and we calculate their diversity, and we then send across the one that has highest diversity. The point, the C that is as far from all the other C's we've sent to the robot as possible. Remember in the Resilient Machines project about an hour ago, we were just saying that the resilient machine, when it's moving, it doesn't do the same thing again, right? It wouldn't make sense, doesn't make sense to send the second highest point because it has low diversity. It's close to this point. So according to that calculation, we would actually send the bottommost point. Okay, we send the bottommost point, and we now know that this has high transferability. This point would be out here. Which of the remaining points is furthest from the topmost point or the lowest most point? It's the point in the middle, right? So that's the one that's going to be sent next. Whenever we send something across to the physical robot, it's an expensive and tiring thing to do for the robot and for the investigator. We're going to pick carefully. Try and send new things. We want to learn new things. Someone in the media, when they reported on this article, they referred to this as curious machines, right? The robot is always thinking to itself, what will happen if I do this next, right? It's always trying to do something very different. Yes?
What do you mean it's tiring for the robot?
It's tiring for the robot because it's running on a battery.
Oh,
You're going to run it down. Also, motors, wear and tear. You don't want to do 1,000 evaluations on the robot. You'd like to do a dozen. Okay, we're almost finished here. This is good timing. Okay. So right, we want to send the one that's most different from the population. Okay, so top pair of images, as we've already seen, is the first one that was sent across, which fails miserably in crossing the reality gap. Right? So they went back and forth, like in the Resilient Machines project. They evolved controllers. They sent the one that was in simulation fast and diverse. They sent that across. That one did mediocre. Sent another one. That one did terribly. They kept going back and forth, back and forth. And so at the end of the experiment, this was the final one they sent across. And they got this. Okay. So the last one crossed the reality gap because now they had enough controllers in CT to know which things transfer well and which things transfer poorly. So they evolved one that's fast in simulation and found one that also had high transferability and sent it. Yes?
which one was that? Which one?
Oh, it's just a cartoon. The one that I was showing you with the gray points aligned along the line. That's not from the actual paper. I made that up. Last question before we break. We still got a couple minutes left. Here's the controller that did not transfer well. Here's the controller that did transfer well. What's the difference?
Looks like the top one actually, well, before it stopped, it looks like the top one was going further.
Faster, like it optimized the simulation.
It's a little faster, I think. Again, I'm not pressing play on both of them at the same time.
Does the one on the bottom turn a little bit to the left as it goes?
Does it turn a little bit to the left as it goes? Yes, a little bit more. So might that matter for crossing the reality gap? I don't know. Rachel?
The bottom one tilts back and forth more.
Tilts back and forth more. Okay. Waddles a little bit more.
You could also say, conversely, like they look very similar, and like why is on the right? Why the heck is one amazing and one doesn't even move at all?
They look very similar, and all the points that were made here are true. They're not identical, right? So is it the floor? Is the floor that's the problem? Thinking about thinking is misleading. Maybe this rocking back and forth allows the robot to apply more vertical force. So when you walk over ice, next time you do it, you'll have plenty of chances, right? When you're walking over ice, you apply force more vertically than you do when you're walking on carpet. You push back and forward more because you're confident your foot will stick and supply an impulse force, right? So maybe if you watch very carefully, this robot is doing something that applies more vertical forces than the one above. I'm not sure. I've seen these videos hundreds of times. I don't know. I know the investigators in France very well. Every time I see them at a conference, I ask them. 8 years in, they still don't know either. So there you go. Okay. You have a quiz due tonight, and you're working on assignment 9. We'll see you next Thursday. Sam Kriegman will be guest lecturing on Tuesday. Thank you very much.